Good evening. This past Saturday morning, something happened that most Americans woke up to find already completed. United States Special Forces conducted airstrikes on Caracas, the capital of Venezuela. Within hours, President Nicolás Maduro and his wife were in custody aboard a U.S. warship heading to New York to face federal charges. If you turned on the news over the weekend, you saw the same images on repeat. Helicopters, explosions lighting up the night sky, Maduro in handcuffs, commentary praising tactical precision, officials calling it a decisive operation against a narco-terrorist regime. And then, almost as quickly as it dominated the headlines, the story began to fade. Other news took over. The spectacle moved on. But here's what I want to talk about today. Not the helicopters, not the dramatic raid, not whether Maduro deserved what happened to him, though there's certainly a case to be made that he did. What I want to examine is what this operation reveals about something much larger, about how American power is being exercised in 2025, about what's happening to the dollar-based economic system many of you built your savings and retirement around, about why Latin America is having conversations with China that it wasn't having 5 years ago, and about what all of this means for your financial security in the years ahead. Because if you're wondering why this happened now, not in 2020, not in 2022, but this specific week in January 2025, the answer isn't about Maduro. It's about oil pricing, currency systems, and economic pressures that have been building quietly while most of us weren't paying attention. And if you're wondering what this means for gas prices, for inflation, for the stability of your retirement portfolio, for the purchasing power of your savings, then you're asking exactly the right questions. My name is Prof. Nouriel Bremmer, and for over 30 years, I worked in international economics and foreign policy. I've watched how these systems operate from the inside, and I've learned that when military force gets used to resolve what are fundamentally economic disputes, the consequences rarely stay contained to one country or one region. So today, I'm going to walk you through what actually happened, why it happened when it did, what the immediate fallout has been, and what scenarios we're likely looking at in the months ahead. I'm not here to tell you whether this was right or wrong. I'm here to help you understand what it means, because understanding is the first step to navigating whatever comes next. Let's begin with what we know. On Saturday, January 4th, at approximately 2 a.m. Caracas time, residents of Venezuela's capital reported hearing explosions, 7 distinct blasts, low-flying aircraft. Within 30 minutes, the operation was complete. President Trump confirmed it himself with a social media post showing Maduro aboard the USS Iwo Jima, restrained and blindfolded. He called it a large-scale strike. Secretary of State Marco Rubio appeared at a press conference. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced federal charges: narcotics conspiracy, cocaine importation, weapons violations. No American casualties were reported. Venezuelan casualties remain unconfirmed, though Colombia's President Gustavo Petro stated that strikes hit military installations, an airbase, and the legislative building. Maduro is now in New York, facing charges that have been sealed since 2020. His wife, Celia Flores, is also in custody. And in Caracas, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez appeared on state television, declaring herself interim president and demanding Maduro's immediate release. Now, here's what makes this operation particularly striking from a diplomatic standpoint. Just 2 days before the raid, Maduro had told a Spanish journalist that Venezuela was ready to discuss drug trafficking cooperation with Washington. Quote, "Wherever they want, whenever they want." According to multiple reports, President Trump and Maduro had spoken by phone in late November. Trump, according to White House officials, presented what one source described as essentially an ultimatum: step down voluntarily or face consequences. Maduro did not step down. He released some political prisoners. He made gestures toward conciliation, but he remained in power. And so planning for this operation began in mid-December. What's critical to understand here is timing. This didn't happen during the Biden administration, even though Maduro has been under federal indictment since 2020. It didn't happen in Trump's first term. It happened now in the first 2 weeks of his second term, before he'd even completed his first month back in office. Why? That's the question most coverage isn't asking, but it's the most important question, because the answer isn't about Maduro's crimes, real as they may be. The answer is about pressure that's been building in the global economic system, pressure that finally reached a breaking point. But before we get to that, let me give you some essential context. Because to understand why Venezuela matters so much right now, you need to understand what happened to Venezuela's economy over the past 25 years. And you need to understand what's been happening in the global oil market, particularly around how oil gets priced and traded. Many of you will remember when Venezuela was the wealthiest country in Latin America. That wasn't ancient history. That was the 1980s and 1990s. Venezuela had the highest per capita income in the region. It had a functioning democracy. It had a middle class. Then came Hugo Chavez in 1999, followed by Nicolás Maduro in 2013. Over 25 years, Venezuela went from prosperity to collapse, hyperinflation, food shortages, a healthcare system that disintegrated. 8 million people, more than a quarter of the population, fled the country. But here's what didn't disappear: the oil. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world. 303 billion barrels. That's roughly 20% of all known reserves globally. It's 4 times what the United States has. It's more than Saudi Arabia. Yet today, Venezuela produces less than 1 million barrels per day, a fraction of what it produced 20 years ago. Infrastructure collapsed, skilled workers left, investment stopped. So if Venezuela can barely produce oil, and if the oil it does produce is going to China at steep discounts through a shadow fleet of tankers, why does it matter strategically to the United States? Because it's not about how much oil Venezuela produces today. It's about who controls those reserves tomorrow. And it's about what currency that oil gets priced in. That's where we need to go next. Let me take a few minutes to explain something that doesn't get discussed much in mainstream coverage, but that affects your financial security every single day. For over 50 years, the global oil market has operated on what's called the petrodollar system. Here's how it works in plain language. After World War II, the United States and its allies created a system where the dollar was backed by gold. Other countries pegged their currencies to the dollar. It provided stability. It worked for about 25 years. Then, in 1971, President Nixon ended that system. Many of you will remember that moment, the gold window closing. The question became, what backs the dollar now, if not gold? The answer came in 1974, when the United States reached an agreement with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would price their oil exclusively in dollars, and in exchange, the United States would provide military protection and security guarantees. This was brilliant from an economic standpoint. Here's why. Every country in the world needs oil. If oil can only be purchased in dollars, then every country in the world needs to hold dollars. That creates automatic, permanent demand for American currency. And that demand allows the United States to do something no other country can do: borrow enormous amounts of money at very low interest rates, because there's always demand for dollar-denominated assets like treasury bonds. Think about it this way. If you're Japan or Germany or South Korea and you need oil, you first have to convert your currency into dollars. Then you buy the oil. That transaction, repeated billions of times across the global economy, creates steady demand for dollars. That demand keeps the dollar strong. It keeps U.S. borrowing costs low. It allows the American government to run deficits that would be unsustainable for other countries. It allows Americans to import goods at lower prices than they otherwise would. This system, economists call it the exorbitant privilege, has been the foundation of American prosperity for 50 years. But here's what's changing, and this is where Venezuela comes into the story. That Saudi agreement from 1974, it expired in June of 2024, and the Saudis chose not to renew it. Saudi Arabia now accepts Chinese yuan for oil sales to China, which is their largest customer. The United Arab Emirates processed $128 billion in trade with China last year entirely in yuan. Russia sells oil to India in rupees and rubles. Iran sells to China in yuan. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from 71% in 1999 to 58% today. That might not sound dramatic, but every percentage point represents approximately $350 billion in reduced demand for U.S. Treasury bonds. Now, you might be thinking, what does this have to do with Venezuela? Here's the connection. Intelligence reports that came out in late December suggested that Venezuela was preparing to officially integrate its energy sector into China's CIPS system. That's China's alternative to the SWIFT banking network that processes international payments. Venezuela was preparing to price its oil, all 300 billion barrels of reserves, not in dollars, but in a basket of currencies led by the Chinese yuan. If that had happened, it would have sent a signal to every oil-producing country in the developing world. You can possess massive resource wealth, you can trade outside the dollar system, and you can survive. From Washington's perspective, that was unacceptable. Now, before we go further, let me explain why this matters to you personally, because I don't want this to feel like abstract geopolitics. If global oil increasingly gets priced in currencies other than dollars, demand for dollars falls. If demand for dollars falls, the dollar's value falls. If the dollar's value falls, everything you buy that's priced in dollars, which is almost everything, gets more expensive. Your grocery bill goes up, your heating costs go up, your gas costs go up. But more than that, if foreign governments need fewer dollars, they buy fewer U.S. Treasury bonds. If they buy fewer Treasury bonds, interest rates rise. If interest rates rise, bond values fall. And if you're in or approaching retirement, if you have money in bond funds or in a 401k that holds Treasury securities, that affects you directly. I'm not saying the sky is falling. I'm saying the system that has kept the dollar stable and borrowing costs low for 50 years is under pressure. And Venezuela just became the test case for how the United States responds to that pressure. So let's talk about timing. Why did this operation happen now, in January 2025, and not 5 years ago? There are several factors that converged. First, energy supply constraints. Over the last 2 years, the Biden administration drained the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the emergency oil stockpile, to keep gas prices down before elections. The SPR is now at its lowest level since 1983, 351 million barrels. That's it. The reserve is supposed to be for war, for genuine emergencies. It's not supposed to be used for political price control, but it was. And now it needs to be refilled, and the global oil market is tight. Second, the relationship with Saudi Arabia has deteriorated. The Saudis are cutting production to keep prices high. They're joining BRICS. They're ignoring calls from Washington. They're no longer functioning as America's gas station the way they did for decades. Third, Russia is under sanctions, so Russian oil isn't available to the United States. Canada is already producing at maximum capacity. That left essentially one option for heavy crude oil that U.S. Gulf Coast refineries are designed to process: Venezuela. But Venezuela's oil was committed. China signed prepayment contracts with Venezuela worth $62 billion between 2007 and 2024. Russia provided another $17 billion in credit lines backed by crude shipments. India now imports 340,000 barrels daily of Venezuelan oil, refines it, and re-exports it to Europe labeled as Indian product. So the United States tried 4 strategies to break this encirclement. First, maximum pressure through sanctions. That failed because Venezuela developed export networks completely outside the SWIFT banking system. Ships with flags of convenience, payments in yuan, refineries in Malaysia. Sanctioning paper doesn't stop oil molecules from moving. Second, regime change through proxies. Washington spent millions backing Juan Guaido, recognizing him as the legitimate president, even though he never controlled a single military barracks. By 2023, even the Venezuelan opposition had abandoned him. Third, diplomatic isolation. That failed because 134 countries never recognized Guaido. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Latin America's major powers all restored diplomatic relations with Caracas between 2022 and 2024. Fourth, conditional licenses. allowing companies like Chevron limited permission to operate in Venezuela, but with strings attached. That's failing right now because Maduro learned the lesson. Never trust American concessions designed as control levers. So Washington was out of options, except one, and then came the final trigger. On December 28th, 1 week before the operation, Nicolás Maduro signed energy agreements with China worth $18 billion. 2 days later, Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, quietly requested a meeting with Venezuelan officials in Panama, not to threaten, not to impose conditions, to negotiate access to oil that Washington has spent 2 decades trying to destroy. Think about that. The United States went from maximum pressure and regime change efforts to quietly asking for a meeting to negotiate oil access. That's not diplomacy, that's capitulation. And it got interrupted by helicopters. Now, here's where Trump's specific approach comes in. Trump's foreign policy team, Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth at Defense, Richard Grenell as Special Envoy, has been very clear about their view of Latin America. They see the hemisphere as America's backyard. They see China's expanding economic presence in the region as a direct threat, and they're willing to use military force to reassert control. At the press conference after the operation, Trump mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, the 19th century policy that claimed the Western Hemisphere as America's sphere of influence. He even joked that some people are now calling it the Donroe Doctrine, inserting his own name. This isn't subtle. This isn't coalition building. This is a return to gunboat diplomacy. And the message to the rest of Latin America was explicit. Trump was asked about Colombia. He said the Colombian president needs to watch his ass because Colombia is flooding the United States with drugs. He talked about Mexico, saying President Claudia Sheinbaum claims she runs Mexico, but actually the cartels run Mexico. The implication was clear: comply or you're next. Now, I need to be very direct about something. I'm not defending Nicolás Maduro. The man oversaw the destruction of his country's economy. He rigged elections. He imprisoned opponents. He turned Venezuela into an authoritarian state with a humanitarian crisis. But the question we have to ask isn't whether Maduro deserved to be removed. The question is, what comes after? And do the people making these decisions have any idea how to build a functioning government in a country of 30 million people? Because history suggests the answer is no. So where are we today, 2 weeks after the operation? Maduro is in a New York courtroom facing federal charges. His legal team is challenging jurisdiction, arguing he was kidnapped in violation of international law. That case will drag on for months, possibly years. In Caracas, the situation is fluid and unstable. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez declared herself interim president, but she doesn't control the military entirely. Some units remain loyal to the Maduro-aligned command structure. Others are waiting to see which way the wind blows. Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her pro-democracy work and who escaped Venezuela last month, posted that the hour of freedom has arrived, but she's in exile. Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition figure whom the United States and other nations recognize as the rightful winner of the disputed 2024 election, hasn't issued a clear public statement about next steps. So you have competing claims to legitimacy. You have a fractured military where every general controls some piece of the economy: mining concessions, ports, oil distribution. You have paramilitary groups called colectivos, maybe 200,000 to 300,000 armed men who control neighborhoods and food distribution. And you have the United States saying it will run Venezuela until a transition is complete. But what does that mean in practice? Will the U.S. install an administrator? Will it maintain military forces on the ground? Will it hold new elections? At the press conference, Trump was asked these questions directly. He had no clear answer. He gestured to the people standing behind him, Rubio, Hegseth, others, and said, "These guys will handle it." That's not a plan. That's a hope. Meanwhile, let's talk about what's happening financially because this affects you. Switzerland announced last week that it's freezing accounts belonging to Maduro and his inner circle. The European Union followed. Banks in London, Frankfurt, and Madrid have been instructed to scrutinize Venezuelan-linked transactions. This is how modern economic warfare works. The United States provides military pressure. Europe provides financial isolation. Together, they create choke points. If you can't insure a tanker, you can't move oil. If you can't clear payments through European banks, you can't settle contracts. If your assets are frozen, you lose liquidity. For Venezuelan elites, the generals, the ministers, the power brokers, this is a crisis. Their wealth is tied up in Miami condos, Madrid real estate, international investments. If those assets are frozen or seized, their ability to operate politically collapses. This gives Washington negotiation leverage, not just with Maduro's people, but with whoever comes next. Now, here's what's been happening behind the scenes that hasn't gotten much attention. President Trump met last week with American oil executives, Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips. According to people familiar with the meetings, discussions focused on contracts, timelines, and security guarantees for operations in Venezuela. Energy Secretary Chris Wright and Secretary of State Marco Rubio have been conducting parallel conversations about how quickly production could be ramped up, what kind of investment would be required, and how revenue would be structured. The optimistic scenario being discussed is that Venezuelan production could reach 1.4 million barrels per day within 18 months and potentially 3 million barrels per day within 5 years if, and this is a very big if political stability holds and if massive investment flows in. Francisco Monaldi, who directs the Latin America Energy Program at Rice University, estimates it would take at least a decade and more than $100 billion in investment to restore production to 4 million barrels per day. That's the scale we're talking about. But here's the problem. No oil company will invest billions of dollars without knowing who they're negotiating with, what the legal framework is, whether contracts will be honored, and whether security can be guaranteed. Right now, nobody has those answers. Let's talk about how the rest of the world has responded, because this tells us a lot about where we are in 2025. Latin America's reaction has been swift and largely negative, at least from the major powers. Brazil's President Lula called the operation a grave affront to sovereignty and an extremely dangerous precedent. Colombia's President Petro condemned it as aggression and said conflicts should be resolved by people themselves in peace. Mexico issued a formal statement calling it a clear violation of the UN Charter. Chile, Cuba, Uruguay, Nicaragua all condemned the strikes. Now, some countries supported it. Argentina's president praised the move. El Salvador's Nayib Bukele, a Trump ally, posted cryptic support. But the major regional powers, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, are not on board. That matters because it signals a shift. For decades, the default assumption in Latin America was that aligning with the United States offered economic benefits and security guarantees. That assumption is now being questioned. Europe's response has been more cautious, but still critical. Spain said it doesn't recognize the Maduro regime, but neither does it support military intervention that violates international law. France's foreign minister said the operation violates the principle of not resorting to force. Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer hedged, saying he wanted to speak with Trump before making firm statements. But the European Union's High Representative said clearly, under all circumstances, the principles of international law and the UN Charter must be respected. Russia condemned the strikes as armed aggression and called for a UN Security Council meeting. That's somewhat rich coming from a country in its 5th year of war in Ukraine. But it's their position. China issued a terse condemnation, stating that the action seriously violates international law and Venezuela's sovereignty. China is Venezuela's top oil customer, so this has direct economic implications for Beijing. Now, here's what's significant about these reactions. The United Nations system depends on the idea that military force against another nation without Security Council authorization is prohibited. This is foundational. This is what supposedly prevents great powers from invading weaker neighbors whenever they want. The United States violated that principle. And when confronted, the response from Washington was essentially, so what? Multiple countries have pointed out that this looks exactly like the kind of unilateral aggression the United States criticizes when Russia or China does it. The hypocrisy is obvious, and it undermines every argument America makes about a rules-based order. Because if rules only apply when convenient, they're not rules, they're preferences, and preferences backed by power are just coercion. But here's the deeper strategic consequence that I think Washington is missing. China didn't respond militarily. Russia didn't intervene. And some analysts are saying, see, the multipolar world isn't that multipolar. The US can still do what it wants. But that's the wrong lesson. China's response isn't military. It's financial. It's economic. It's diplomatic. Every country watching this, especially countries with natural resources, especially countries in the developing world, is drawing the same conclusion. If you align too closely with the United States, if you make decisions Washington doesn't like, you become vulnerable. Your sovereignty becomes conditional. Your leaders might end up in handcuffs on a U.S. warship. So what do? You diversify. You move your reserves into gold. You join CIPS, China's payment system. You sign trade deals in local currencies. You reduce your exposure to the dollar-based financial system as quickly as possible. Venezuela was supposed to demonstrate American strength. Instead, it's accelerating the exact trend Washington was trying to prevent, countries moving away from dollar dependence. Now, let me bring this back to what it means for you personally, because that's what matters most. Let's start with energy prices. In the very short term, the next few weeks, you probably won't see much change at the pump. Oil markets have remained relatively calm because Venezuela's current production is so low that its temporary removal doesn't materially affect global supply. But markets don't just react to current supply, they react to expectations. If the optimistic scenario plays out, if Venezuela stabilizes, if American oil companies invest, if production ramps up over the next 5 to 10 years, that additional supply could ease prices. Heavy crude from Venezuela is particularly valuable for diesel production, and diesel supply has been tight globally. That could mean lower costs for transportation, for heating oil, for the diesel that powers trucks delivering goods. That filters through to consumer prices eventually. But, and this is important, that's the optimistic scenario, and it requires political stability that doesn't exist right now. The pessimistic scenario is that Venezuela fragments, that you get ongoing instability, resistance movements, sabotage of oil infrastructure. In that case, production stays disrupted, possibly for years. That keeps supply tight and prices elevated. So on energy, we're in a wait-and-see period. I'd say 6 months before we know which direction this is heading. Now, let's talk about the dollar and your savings. This is where things get more concerning, and I want to be straight with you about it. The operation in Venezuela was meant to secure American control over those oil reserves and prevent China from establishing an independent energy supply priced in yuan. Short term, it accomplished that. Maduro is gone. Chinese contracts are in limbo. But strategically, it may have backfired because every country that was considering joining BRICS, every country that was thinking about diversifying away from the dollar, every country that was on the fence about China's alternative systems, they just got pushed off the fence. They looked at Venezuela and thought, if I don't comply with Washington's preferences, will they come for me next? That fear doesn't create loyalty. It creates an exodus, and we're already seeing it. At the BRICS summit last October, Russia announced development of BRICS Pay, a blockchain-based payment system that bypasses the dollar entirely. Brazil is piloting it. South Africa processed its first diamond transaction in November. Iran and Russia are settling arms sales through it. Venezuela has applied for formal BRICS membership. If accepted, and it will be, its 300 billion barrels of reserves will be integrated into an economic architecture that's isolated from Washington. Now, what does this mean for your retirement savings? If global trade increasingly moves away from the dollar, demand for dollars falls. If demand for dollars falls, foreign governments buy fewer U.S. Treasury bonds. If they buy fewer Treasury bonds, yields rise to attract buyers. If yields rise, bond prices fall. And if you hold bond funds in your 401k or IRA, which most Americans do, especially those approaching or in retirement, that affects the value of your portfolio. I'm not saying sell everything in panic. I'm saying this is a trend to watch. And if it accelerates, you may want to talk to a financial advisor about whether your bond allocation makes sense in an environment where the dollar is losing global reserve status. There's also the inflation question. For 50 years, the dollar's reserve status meant that inflation generated by U.S. government spending got exported to the rest of the world. Other countries held our currency, so they absorbed part of the inflationary pressure. If that system weakens, more of that inflation stays here. It shows up in prices you pay at the grocery store, at the gas station, in your utility bills. You've already seen it. The dollar you earned in 2020 buys about 77 cents worth of goods today. That's 23% loss of purchasing power in 5 years. If the dollar's global role continues to erode, that trend could accelerate. Again, I'm not trying to alarm you. I'm trying to prepare you, because understanding what's happening gives you time to adjust. One more thing I want to mention, and this is more personal. Many of you grew up in an era when America was seen as a force for stability and international law, when military action was a last resort, not a first option, when there were rules and even powerful countries at least pretended to follow them. Watching that credibility erode, watching the United States act in ways that look like the behavior it used to condemn, that's unsettling in ways that go beyond economics. It affects how the world sees America, and it affects how Americans see themselves. I hear this from people your age all the time. There's a sense of loss, a sense that something fundamental has changed about the country's role in the world, and not for the better. I don't have easy answers for that, but I think it's important to name it because it's real. So let me walk you through 3 possible paths forward. I can't tell you which one we'll get, but understanding the scenarios helps you think about what to watch for. Scenario A, controlled transition. This is the optimistic case. The United States brokers a deal between remnants of Maduro's government and the opposition. A transitional authority gets established. Elections happen within a year. Maria Corina Machado or Edmundo Gonzalez takes power with legitimacy. Oil contracts get renegotiated. American companies invest. Production ramps up gradually over 5 to 10 years. Venezuela stabilizes. The humanitarian crisis eases. Refugees start returning. In this scenario, you'd see oil supply increase, prices moderate, and the operation viewed as messy but ultimately successful. Probability, I'd say 20 to 25%. It requires cooperation from multiple factions who hate each other, years of institution building, and no spoilers. Scenario B, fragmentation. This is the realistic middle case. The government fractures, regional power centers emerge, some areas controlled by military units loyal to the old regime, others by opposition groups, others by criminal networks. Oil production stays disrupted because the security situation makes investment impossible. American companies demand more protection. That means more U.S. personnel on the ground, even if they're called contractors. You get low-level resistance, not full insurgency, but enough disruption to make governance impossible. Targeted strikes, protests, sabotage. Within a year, you have congressional hearings asking why billions in reconstruction aid disappeared with nothing to show for it. Trump blames the Venezuelan opposition for incompetence. The situation drags on. In this scenario, energy supply stays tight, prices remain elevated, and instability persists. Probability, 50 to 60%. This is the Iraq-Libya pattern. Easy to topple governments, extraordinarily difficult to build them. Scenario C, great power competition. This is the concerning case. China doesn't accept the outcome. Beijing continues buying Venezuelan oil through shadow tankers. It provides financial support to resistance elements. It uses leverage in other Latin American countries to isolate U.S.-backed structures. Russia does the same. They turn Venezuela into a long-term economic battleground. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, uncomfortable with how this operation unfolded, start hedging their bets. They maintain diplomatic relations with whoever emerges in Caracas, but they also deepen ties with China. In this scenario, the hemisphere fractures into competing spheres of influence. Latin America becomes a contested space between US and Chinese economic systems. Oil production recovers slowly, but increasingly flows to China, not the United States. The dollar's decline accelerates, and the operation is viewed in hindsight as a strategic blunder that pushed Latin America toward Beijing. Probability? 20 to 25%. It's the worst case, but it's not implausible. What to watch for? Over the next 3 months, here's what will tell you which scenario we're heading toward. First, does oil production actually increase or does it stagnate? If Chevron and other companies can operate safely and production ticks up, that's a good sign. If they can't, or if sabotage becomes common, that's a bad sign. Second, does a legitimate transitional government emerge with buy-in from multiple factions, or do we see competing power centers? Unity is good. Fragmentation is bad. Third, how do Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico respond over the next 6 months? If they maintain distance from US-backed structures, if they deepen China ties, that tells you Latin America is hedging against Washington. Fourth, watch currency markets and BRICS expansion. If more countries join, if more trade moves to yuan or local currencies, the dollar's decline accelerates. Those are the indicators. Stay informed about those, and you'll see which path we're on. Let me bring this together. What happened in Venezuela wasn't primarily about Nicolás Maduro. It was about oil reserves, currency systems, and economic pressure that had been building for years. The United States used military force to resolve what is fundamentally an economic dispute. Whether that was justified is a political question. What the consequences will be is an economic question. And the honest answer is, we don't know yet. We're too early in the process, but we can identify what's at stake. For the dollar's global role, this could be the beginning of a managed decline, or it could accelerate a collapse that happens faster than anyone expects. For oil prices, this could eventually ease supply constraints, or it could create prolonged instability that keeps prices elevated. For Latin America, this could reassert US influence, or it could push the hemisphere toward China in ways that won't be reversed. For your financial security, this could be a blip that doesn't materially affect your retirement planning, or it could be the early warning sign of currency and inflation pressures that require adjustments to how you're positioned. I can't tell you which outcome we'll get. What I can tell you is that understanding these dynamics helps you navigate whatever comes. This isn't about panic, it's about preparation. The more you understand, the better decisions you can make. Next week, I'll be looking at what's happening with China's positioning in the Middle East and what that means for energy markets, because this story is bigger than Venezuela. It's about a fundamental shift in how global power is distributed and how economics and military force intersect. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe. I publish in-depth briefings like this twice a week, every Tuesday and Friday. And if you know someone who would benefit from this kind of analysis, share it with them. My goal is to treat you like an intelligent adult who wants to understand the world, not react to headlines. Thank you for your time and your attention. I'll see you next day.